He's 75, and they say his heart is made of stone. But as his hands tightened on my waist, I realized I didn't want him to let go. I didn't scream when they forced me into the lace dress. I screamed when Taejun Dongho leaned in and whispered the one secret that made me realize I was no longer a daughter. I was a weapon. Welcome to the Hidden Epic, besties. I'm Lillian. You asked for a story that would make your heart race, and trust me, if you stop watching now, you'll be up all night wondering how I survived the Silver Lion of Seoul. So, stay with me as we drive through emotions and romance. The white lace wedding dress didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a shroud. I stood in the silent chapel, 22 years old and sold to a man who owns half of Korea. My father didn't just give me away, he bowed to Taejun Dongho like he was a god. Looking in the mirror, the girl staring back was a stranger. My African features were framed by polished waves of hair, and my eyes, usually so full of life, were locked in a searching gaze, looking for a way out. But there was no exit. I was the peace offering for a debt I didn't create. The door clicked. Taejun Dongho entered, and the air left the room. At 75, he didn't look like a grandfather. He looked like a predator. His silver hair caught the light, and that faint tattoo on his neck, the one they say he got after his first kill, sent a shiver down my spine. "You look like you're waiting for an execution, Lillian," he said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble in perfect English. I lifted my chin, my arms resting around his neck as he gripped my waist with hands of iron. "Isn't that what this is?" He pulled me closer, his predatory gaze unreadable. "No, an execution is quick. This is a transformation." 3 months ago, my life was simple in Uganda. Then my family's business interests collided with the wrong people in Seoul. A $500,000 merger went south, and my father was left facing men who don't take no for an answer. Taejun Dongho appeared like a shadow in the night. He didn't ask for the money, he asked for me. Within weeks, I was on a flight to South Korea with a suitcase and a contract. I was told he was too old to be a threat. They said he just wanted a young face to show off at galas. They were wrong. As we stood there in that chapel, his hands weren't trembling. They were steady, possessive. "I'm told they think I'm a gold digger," I whispered, my eyes searching his for a flicker of mercy. "And they think you're a frail old man." Taejun leaned in, his silver earring glinting. "Let them think that, Lillian. It's easier to kill them when they don't see the blow coming. Now, are you ready to be a queen, or do you want to remain a victim?" The descent into Incheon International Airport felt like a fall from grace. As the plane dipped through the heavy, gray clouds of Seoul, I clutched the armrests until my knuckles turned as pale as the silk wedding dress folded in the garment bag above me. Only 48 hours ago, I was Lillian Albert, a university student in Kampala with a future that belonged to me. Now I was a line item in a ledger, a human bridge spanning 2 continents to close a gap left by my father's greed. The airport was a blur of steel and glass, a cold contrast to the vibrant, dusty warmth of home. I didn't have to look for my escort. They found me. 4 men in identical black suits stood like statues at the gate, their eyes scanning the crowd with a clinical precision that made my skin crawl. They didn't carry signs with my name. They simply converged on me the moment I stepped off the jet bridge, forming a human wall that separated me from the rest of the world. "Miss Albert," one said, his English clipped and formal. "The chairman is waiting." He didn't ask for my passport. He already had it. He didn't ask for my bags. They were already being loaded into a black sedan that looked like it could withstand a landmine. As we sped toward the heart of Seoul, the neon lights of the city began to bleed together. I watched the skyscrapers rise like jagged teeth against the night sky, realizing that this wasn't a city, it was a fortress, and I was being delivered to its king. We pulled up to a traditional estate tucked behind high stone walls in the middle of the modern city, a place where the old world met the new with a violent elegance. The air inside the courtyard was thick with the scent of pine and something metallic, something that smelled like old coins and wet pavement. My father had told me this was a business merger. He had hugged me at the airport in Entebbe, whispering that Taejun Dongho was a man of honor who would provide for our family. But as I was led through the sliding paper doors of the estate, I saw the truth. This wasn't a corporate office, it was a war room. Men stood in every shadow, their hands hovering near their waistbands, their eyes flickering to the ink on their necks. I was led into a vast, minimalist hall where a single man sat on a low cushion, a small table with tea set before him. Taejun Dongho. Up close, the 75-year-old man my father described was a lie. He didn't look like a man at the end of his life. He looked like a man who had mastered the art of staying alive while everyone else died. His silver hair was swept back with military precision, and his suit was tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. The silver earring in his left ear caught the light, a rebellious spark in an otherwise disciplined frame. But it was the tattoo creeping up the side of his neck, a dark, intricate dragon's tail that held my gaze. It was the mark of a life lived in the red. He didn't stand. He simply watched me walk toward him, his expression as unreadable as a stone wall. I felt the weight of the searching gaze that I had inherited from my mother, a look that sought the soul behind the mask. But with Taejun, there was only the mask. "Sit," he commanded. The word wasn't a request. I sank on the cushion opposite him, my back straight, refusing to let him see the tremor in my hands. "My father said you were a businessman," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his piercing, hawk-like eyes. "In so, Lillian, there is no difference between business and war. Your father's merger didn't just save his company, it saved his life. And in return, he gave me the only thing he had left that was untainted." He reached across the table, his fingers grazing the back of my hand. His skin was warm, his grip firm and possessive. It wasn't the touch of an old man seeking comfort, it was the touch of a conqueror claiming territory. "You are not here to be a wife in the way the world understands it," he whispered, his deep voice vibrating in the quiet room. "You are here because the men who want my throne think I am weak because of my age. They think a young bride is a vulnerability they can exploit." I pulled my hand back, my eyes narrowing. "So I'm a shield?" Taejun leaned forward, the predatory intensity in his gaze making my heart hammer against my ribs. "No, Lillian, a shield is passive. I have enough shields. I bought you because I think you are a sword. By the time we walk down that aisle tomorrow, the world will think you are my greatest weakness, and that is exactly when we will show them how wrong they are." In that moment, looking into those cold, silver-gray eyes, the reality of my new life crashed down on me. I wasn't just marrying a man, I was joining a syndicate. I wasn't a bride, I was a strategic move in a game I didn't yet know how to play. I was 22, thousands of miles from home, and I had just signed my life over to a 75-year-old ghost who was more alive and more dangerous than any man I had ever met. The merger was complete. The war had begun. The heavy oak door of the master suite clicked shut behind us, a sound that echoed like a gavel in the vast, silent mansion. The room was a sanctuary of dark wood and floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the glittering, indifferent sprawl of Seoul.
I stood by the edge of the massive bed, my fingers still tangled in the white lace of my skirts, feeling the weight of the diamonds at my throat like a physical burden. I didn't turn around. I could hear the rhythmic, steady click of Tae-jun's leather shoes against the polished floor as he approached. "You haven't looked at me once since we left the chapel," he said, his voice low and vibrating through the air between us. I forced myself to face him. He had removed his suit jacket, draped carelessly over a chair, leaving him in a crisp black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The move revealed more than just his forearms. It showed the scars that traced lines through his aged, muscular skin, reminders of a life lived on the edge of a blade. The dragon on his neck seemed to coil tighter as he stepped into the soft amber glow of the bedside lamp. "You are looking at me now," I whispered, my chin tilted high. "What do you want to see? Fear? Regret?" Tae-jun stopped inches from me. He didn't smell like an old man. He smelled of expensive tobacco, sandalwood, and a sharp, metallic edge that I was beginning to recognize as the scent of power. He reached out, his hand hovering near my face. I didn't flinch, though every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run. He didn't touch my cheek. Instead, he reached for the bouquet of white and yellow roses I was still clutching. He took the flowers from my hand and laid them on the nightstand. Then he turned his palms upward, holding them out for me to inspect. "Look at them, Lillian," he commanded. I looked. His hands were large, steady, and calloused. Across the knuckles of his right hand, there was a fresh, jagged split in the skin, a dark crust of blood beginning to form. It wasn't the blood of a victim. It was the blood of a man who had used his hands to strike. "My men caught a traitor while we were at the altar," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He thought I would be too distracted by my young, beautiful bride to notice the shadow in the garden. I had to remind him that the silver lion doesn't sleep, even when he's celebrating. A cold dread settled in my stomach. "You did that? On our wedding day?" "I did that to ensure you would have a wedding night," he countered, stepping closer until I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "In my world, Lillian, there is no time off. There is only survival. You think you've married a man who wants a companion for his twilight years. You think you can play the part of the dutiful wife and hide in this mansion while I handle the world." He grabbed my hand, pressing my palm directly against the split skin of his knuckles. I gasped, the warmth of his blood staining my fingertips, a stark, visceral contrast to the purity of my white dress. "I want to see if you have the stomach for this," he hissed, his silver-gray eyes boring into mine with a predatory intensity. "This is the blood on my hands, Lillian. It's the price of the life you're about to lead. If you're going to be my queen, you cannot look away when the world turns red. You asked for mercy in the chapel with your eyes, but mercy is a luxury I cannot afford, and neither can you." I stared at the blood on my fingers, then slowly lifted my gaze back to his. My heart was hammering, a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but a new feeling was rising through the terror, a spark of defiance. I didn't pull my hand away. Instead, I tightened my grip on his wrist, steadying my own breathing until it matched his. "You think I'm fragile because I'm young," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. "But I come from a place where we know how to survive, too. My father didn't sell me because I was weak. He sold me because I was the only thing he had that was worth your time." I reached for a silk handkerchief on the nightstand, dipped it into the water glass, and began to wipe the blood from his knuckles with slow, deliberate movements. I didn't look away from his eyes once. "If you wanted a victim, you should have bought someone else," I whispered. "But if you wanted a partner, then stop trying to scare me and start teaching me." Something flickered in Taejun's unreadable expression. Not amusement this time, but a deep, dark approval. He remained still as I cleaned his hand, the tension in the room shifting from predator and prey to something far more complex. "The silver lion doesn't have partners," he murmured, his voice softening just a fraction as he leaned down until his breath brushed my ear. "He has an empire, and tonight, Lillian, you've earned the right to see how we keep it." He didn't claim me that night in the way the world expected. Instead, he sat with me in the silence of the high-rise, watching the city below, and began to tell me the names of the men who wanted us dead. The white lace was stained, but as I looked at my reflection in the dark window, I realized the girl with the searching gaze was gone. In her place stood someone who was finally starting to see. The sun had barely begun to bleed over the jagged Seoul skyline when my new education began. I quickly realized that in the house of Taejun Dongho, silence was not peace, it was a strategic disadvantage. For the first week, the mansion's staff and Taejun's lieutenants treated me like a piece of fine porcelain, expensive, decorative, and entirely deaf. They spoke around me in rapid-fire Korean, their voices sharp and percussive, assuming that my Ugandan upbringing left me trapped behind a linguistic wall I could never scale. They were wrong. I didn't ask Taejun for jewelry or clothes. I asked for a tutor. But I didn't want the polite, formal Korean taught in universities. I wanted the grit. I wanted the dialect of the streets and the coded slang of the boardroom. I spent my days in the library with an elderly woman named Mrs. Park, a former court translator who understood that I wasn't learning to be polite. I was learning to survive.
Knowledge is the only currency that doesn't devalue when the market crashes. Taejun had told me one evening as he watched me pore over Hangul characters. He stood by the window, his silver hair catching the moonlight, the dragon on his neck appearing to move as he spoke. He didn't offer to help. He simply provided the resources and watched to see if I would drown or swim. By the second month, the characters on the page began to hum with meaning. The sounds that once felt like a chaotic storm began to resolve into patterns. I practiced until my jaw ached, whispering the vowels into my pillow at night. But the real test wasn't in the library. It was in the shadow of the formal dining room during the business dinners Taejun hosted. I wore my role as the clueless trophy bride like a second skin. I would sit at the long obsidian table, draped in silk and gold, my eyes wide and vacantly beautiful. I perfected the art of the searching gaze that looked like innocence but acted like a recording device. The breakthrough happened during a rainy Tuesday dinner. 3 of Taejun's mid-level captains, men with hungry eyes and expensive watches, sat across from us. They bowed deeply to Taejun, calling him Hwejongnim with a reverence that didn't reach their hearts. They looked at me and smirked, one of them making a comment in Korean about how the old lion was wasting his time with a pretty flower from the savannah. I kept my expression neutral, sipping my tea, though the insult burned like acid. "He's getting slow," the man to my left, Captain Choi, muttered to his associate in a low, casual tone, certain I was only focused on the placement of my chopsticks. "The shipments at the Incheon docks are being rerouted. He hasn't noticed because he's too busy looking at her." "The Japanese were moved by the end of the month," the other replied, his voice a mere vibration. "If the old lion doesn't step down, the docks will run red. We need to decide which side of the blade we want to be on."
My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic drumming. I didn't flinch. I didn't look at Taejun. I simply reached for a piece of kimchi, my hand steady, while my mind raced to translate the gravity of what I'd just heard. They weren't just complaining, they were calculating the date of his execution. When the dinner ended and the men bowed their way out, the silence of the mansion felt heavier than usual. Taejun stood by the fireplace, pouring a glass of dark whiskey. He looked tired, the first time I had truly seen the weight of his 75 years. "He think you are a distraction, Lillian," he said in English, his back to me. "Perhaps they are right. Perhaps I am getting soft." I walked over to him, the silk of my dress hissing against the floor. I didn't speak in English. I leaned in close, my breath brushing the silver stubble on his jaw, and whispered in the sharp, guttural Korean I had spent weeks mastering. "Captain Choi is rerouting the Incheon shipments, and the Japanese are moving at the end of the month. They are waiting for you to fall so they can claim the docks." Taejun froze. He didn't turn around immediately. The only sign of his shock was the slight tightening of his grip on the crystal glass. Slowly, he turned to face me, his silver-gray eyes wide with a mixture of predatory surprise and a new, burning respect.
"You understood them?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "I understood everything," I replied, switching back to English, my voice steady. "They think I'm a flower, Taejun, but flowers don't just sit there. Some of them are poisonous." A dark, slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile I had seen from him. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, his touch no longer just possessive, but recognizing. "I told you I bought a sword," he murmured. "It seems I chose one with a very sharp edge." That night, the power dynamic in the mansion shifted. I was no longer just the bride from Uganda. I was the ears of the Silver Lion. I had traded my silence for the language of power, and for the first time since arriving in Seoul, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like a threat. The Grand Hyatt ballroom was a sea of shimmering glass and cold ambition. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen rain from the ceiling, casting a sharp, unforgiving light on the elite of Seoul's underworld. I walked at Taejun's side, the heavy silk of my emerald green gown trailing behind me like a shadow. My hair was swept up in a regal crown of braids, revealing the high collar of my dress and the searching gaze I had now weaponized. I felt the eyes of the room on us before we even reached the center of the floor. It was a physical weight, the collective sneer of 100 powerful men and their perfectly manicured wives. To them, I was a curiosity, a dark-skinned novelty bought from a distant land to entertain an old man's vanity. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the urge to shrink back into the safety of the Ugandan streets I knew. But Taejun's hand was firm on the small of my back. His touch was a silent command, "Stand tall." We were approached by a group of high-ranking associates, led by a man named Director Kang. He was younger than Taejun, with a face that looked like it had been stretched tight by too many plastic surgeries, and a smile that didn't reach his hollow eyes. His wife stood beside him, draped in enough diamonds to fund a small city, looking at me with a pity that felt like a slap. "Taejuna," Kang said, using a tone of familiarity that was a calculated insult to a man of Taejun's stature. "I see you brought your ward. She is quite striking, like something out of a documentary." The man around him chuckled, a low, oily sound. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, my fingers digging into the fabric of my clutch. I understood every word of the subtle Korean jab. He was calling me an animal, a primitive prize. "She is my wife, Kang,"
Taejun said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that should have served as a final warning. Of course, Kang's wife chimed in, her voice a shrill silk. It must be so lonely for her, though, being so far from home, married to a man who, well, a man who could be her grandfather. Tell me, dear, do you find it difficult to keep him awake after 9, or is the money enough to keep you satisfied? The circle of onlookers went silent, the air in the ballroom suddenly thin. I felt the gaze of the silver lion shift beside me. Taejun didn't shout. He didn't even move his hand from my back, but the atmosphere around him changed, the temperature dropping until I could almost see my breath.
Kang, Taejun said. The name was a death sentence wrapped in a whisper. Taejun stepped forward, closing the small gap between him and the director. He was 75, but in that moment, he looked like a titan made of granite. He reached out and adjusted the lapel of Kang's expensive suit, a gesture that seemed fatherly until you saw the way Kang's entire body began to tremble. My wife is the only person in this room who has the courage to look me in the eye without flinching, Taejun said, his voice carrying to the edges of the silent circle. She has learned our language, she has survived our winters, and she has shown more loyalty in 3 months than you have in 30 years. You think her youth makes her a joke? No, her youth is the fuel for my fire. Taejun leaned in closer, his silver earring glinting under the chandeliers, his voice dropping to a terrifying guttural register. If your wife ever speaks to the queen of my house like that again, I won't just take your business, I will take your tongue, and I will make you watch as I feed it to the dogs in my courtyard. Do I make myself clear, or have you forgotten whose name is on the buildings you stand in? Kang turned the color of ash. He couldn't even speak. He simply bowed so low his forehead almost touched the floor, his wife stumbling as she followed suit. They backed away into the crowd, fleeing like shadows fleeing the sun. Taejun turned back to me. The predatory fire in his eyes didn't vanish, but it softened as he looked at me. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, moving with a tenderness that felt more intimate than any kiss. "Are you all right, Lillian?" he asked in English. I took a breath, my heart slowing its frantic pace. The poisoned rose of the evening had been crushed, and for the first time I realized that Taejun didn't protect me because I was weak. He protected me because I was his. "I'm fine," I said, my voice clear and steady as I looked into those silver-gray eyes. "I just didn't know you cared so much about my sleep schedule." Taejun let out a short, rare bark of a laugh, his hand sliding up to cup my neck. "They see an old man and a girl. They have no idea they are looking at the 2 people who are going to burn this city down if it touches us again." He led me back into the center of the room, and this time the crowd parted like the Red Sea. I wasn't just a bride anymore. I was the silver lion's shadow, and the world had finally learned to be afraid. The rainy season in Seoul turned the world into a series of blurred, charcoal-gray reflections. Inside the mansion, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and expensive incense. Taejun had been distant for days, buried in phone calls that ended in hushed, violent tones. The silver lion was restless, and when he was restless, the entire house held its breath. I found him in the private study, a room I usually avoided. It was a masculine sanctuary of dark mahogany and leather, lit only by the flickering orange glow of a dying fire. Taejun was slumped in his chair, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, a glass of amber liquid sweating on the desk beside him. He looked every bit of his 75 years in that light, not weak, but burdened, like an old oak tree bowing under the weight of a century of storms. I moved silently across the rug, the silk of my nightgown whispering against my ankles. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but my hand stopped in midair. He was asleep, his head tilted back, exposing the full length of his neck. For the first time, I could see the tattoo clearly without him moving or pulling away. It wasn't just a decorative dragon, it was a masterpiece of pain. The tail of the beast coiled around his jugular, but as I leaned closer, I realized the scales were actually tiny, intricate names written in a script so small they looked like texture. At the very center of the dragon's heart, just above his collarbone, was a date and a name: Unbi.
His voice was a sandpaper rasp that made me jump. I hadn't seen his eyes open. He didn't move, but his silver-gray gaze was fixed on the ceiling, distant and hollow. "My daughter," he whispered. I sank to the floor beside his chair, my hand finally finding his. His skin was cold. "Taejun, I didn't know." "No one does," he said, finally sitting up and looking at me. The predatory mask was gone, replaced by a raw, ancient grief that made my heart ache. "They think this tattoo is a warning. They think I wear it to show the world I am a monster. And I am, but I didn't start that way." He traced the ink on his neck with a trembling finger. 30 years ago, I tried to leave. I thought I had made enough money, bought enough peace, but the men I served didn't believe in retirement. They sent a message. They meant to hit me, but they hit the car she was in. She died in my arms, right here in this city, on a night as rainy as this one. He took a long, shaky breath, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "The dragon doesn't represent my power, Lillian. It represents the cage I built for myself. Every name in these scales is someone I had to eliminate to ensure no one could ever hurt what belonged to me again. I stopped being a man that night. I became a shadow." He looked at me then, his gaze searching mine with a vulnerability that was terrifying. "When I saw you in your father's office, I didn't just see a beautiful woman. I saw a chance to protect something pure one last time. I wanted to see if I could keep one thing in this world from turning to ash." I reached up, my thumb gently stroking the ink over his heartbeat. The monster of soul was just a father who had never been allowed to mourn. The age gap between us didn't feel like a chasm in that moment. It felt like a bridge. He was a man at the end of a long, bloody road, and I was the first person he had allowed to see the wounds he carried. "You aren't a shadow, Taejun," I whispered, leaning my forehead against his knee. "And I'm not a prize to be kept in a cage. If you want to protect me, don't just build walls. Let me help you carry the weight." Taejun reached down, his large hand cupping the back of my head, his fingers tangling in my hair. He pulled me up until I was eye level with him. For a long time, we just sat there in the fading firelight, the African girl and the Korean king, two souls bound by a contract, but held together by a shared understanding of loss. "The world is coming for us, Lillian," he murmured, his forehead resting against mine. "The men who killed Unbi, their sons are the ones whispering at the docks." "Then let them come," I said, my voice hardening with a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. "They think they're fighting an old man. They don't know he has a queen now." He kissed my forehead, not a kiss of possession this time, but one of true heartbreaking alliance. The lace of my gown felt lighter, and the shadow on his neck didn't look like a warning anymore. It looked like a map, and for the first time, I knew exactly where we were going. The rainy season showed no signs of relenting, turning the city into a labyrinth of mist and neon. Taejun had been called away to an emergency meeting at the Incheon docks, leaving the mansion feeling unnervingly hollow. I spent the evening in the library, the glow of my tablet illuminating the Hangul characters I was still perfecting when the heavy doors creaked open. I expected a maid with tea, but instead it was Captain Choi. He was one of the younger men I had overheard at the dinner weeks ago, the one who had called me a pretty flower and whispered about Taejun's waning power. He was barely 30, with a sharp, idol-like jawline and eyes that moved with a restless, hungry energy. Unlike the other men in the organization, he didn't bow when he entered. He simply leaned against the doorframe, a confident, pitying smile playing on his lips.
"It's a tragedy, really," he said in smooth, flawless English, his voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "A woman like you, Lillian, locked away in this museum with a man who is more monument than human." I didn't rise. I didn't even look up from my tablet. "The monument is the reason you have a job, Captain Choi. I'd be careful how you speak of your chairman." He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the mahogany shelves. He crossed the room with an easy, athletic grace that was meant to highlight exactly what my husband lacked: youth. He stopped just inches from my chair, invading my space in a way Taejun never did without permission. "The chairman is a legend, yes, but legends belong in history books, not in the beds of young women," Choi whispered, leaning down. "I've seen how you look at the world, Lillian, that searching gaze of yours. You're looking for a way out, aren't you? You're looking for someone who can actually give you a life, not just a gilded cage and a front row seat to a funeral." He reached out as if to touch a stray lock of my hair, but I pulled back, my eyes narrowing. "I have a plan," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum. "I have the men, the ships, and the backing of the Japanese. I can get you out of Korea tonight. I can send you back to Uganda with enough money to make your father a king. You don't have to wait for the old lion to die. You can be free now. Just give me the codes to his private accounts, the ones he thinks only his loyal wife knows." For a split second, the offer hung in the air like a siren song. Freedom, Uganda, a life without the smell of gunpowder and the weight of silver-gray eyes. Choi watched me, his expression melting into what he thought was a heroic mask. He looked like the hero of a movie, the young savior coming to rescue the damsel from the monster. But I wasn't looking at his face, I was looking at his hands. His fingers were twitching with a nervous, greedy energy. And then I saw it, the glint of silver ring on his pinky finger, the exact insignia of the rival gang that had tried to hit our car on the wedding day. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Choi wasn't here to save me. He was the shadow in the garden. He was the one who had tried to kill us. My searching gaze finally saw him for what he was, a pretender. Taejun was a predator, yes, but he was an honest one. He had bought me, protected me, and shared his soul with me. Choi was a scavenger, a man who would use me to gut the empire and then discard me the moment I was no longer useful. "You're right, Captain Choi," I said, my voice as cold as the rain outside. I stood up slowly, closing the distance between us until I was looking him straight in the eyes. I let a small, deceptive smile touch my lips. "Taejun is old. He moves slowly. He trusts me with everything." Choi's eyes lit up with triumph. "Exactly. So tell me the codes. Let's end this." "I'll tell you something better," I whispered, leaning in as if to share a kiss. I switched to the guttural, sharp Korean I had learned in secret. "I'll tell you that the silver lion isn't at the docks. He's in the security room, watching this through the camera hidden behind the third shelf."
The color drained from Choi's face as fast as if a ghost had passed through him. He spun around, his hand reaching for the holster at his hip, but it was too late. The library doors didn't just open, they were thrown back with a violence that shook the walls. Taejun walked in, his black overcoat glistening with rain, his silver-gray eyes burning with a fire that made Choi's youth look like a flickering candle. He didn't say a word. He simply walked up to Choi and delivered a single, crushing blow to the younger man's jaw. Choi went down like a felled tree, gasping for air on the rug. Taejun didn't even look at the man on the floor. He looked at me. He saw the way I was standing, not cowering, but poised, my hand resting on the heavy bronze bust I had been ready to use as a weapon.
He thought I was a victim, I said, my voice steady. He thought I would trade a king for a rat. Taejun walked over to me, his hand finding the back of my neck, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a pride that was almost overwhelming. "The young always think they are faster," Taejun murmured, his gaze returning to the groveling captain on the floor. "But they forget that the old lion survived because he knows every trap in the jungle." He pulled me against his side, his arm an iron band around my waist. The young pretender was dragged out of the room by the real shadows of the house, and as the doors closed, I realized I didn't want the exit Choi had offered. I had found my place in the war, and for the first time I wasn't grateful for the safety, I was grateful for the power. The annual White Tiger Gala was the most dangerous night of the year. A shimmering masquerade where every smile was a bluff and every tuxedo hid a weapon. The ballroom of the Lotte World Tower felt like a gilded cage suspended in the sky, 100 floors above the rain-slicked streets of Seoul. I walked at Taejun's side, my gown a structured masterpiece of gold African wax print fused with black silk, a visual declaration that I was no longer just a guest in his world. Taejun's grip on my waist was firm, but I felt the subtle tension in his frame. The silver lion was prowling. We had known for weeks that the Japanese syndicate, bolstered by the remnants of Captain Choi's traitors, would strike tonight. They thought they had cornered an aging king. They didn't realize he was bait. "Remember, Lillian," Taejun murmured, his voice barely a vibration against my ear as we moved through the crowd of bowing elite. "When the lights go, you move toward the kitchen service lift. My men will be there to take you to the extraction point. Don't look back for me." "I don't leave my own behind, Taejun," I whispered back in the sharp Korean I had perfected. He gave me a rare, pained look, the shadow of In-bi flickering in his silver eyes. "Tonight is about survival, not pride. I won't lose you too." Before I could argue, the world went black. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, lasting only a heartbeat before the screams began. In the void, the sound of breaking glass and the rhythmic, terrifying thud of silenced rounds echoed against the marble walls. Chaos erupted as the emergency red lights flickered on, casting the ballroom in a bloody, hellish glow. I felt Taejun's hand release my waist as he shoved me toward the service entrance. "Go!" he roared, drawing a sleek black pistol from his waistband with the speed of a man 40 years younger. I ran, the heavy fabric of my dress gathered in my fists. I reached the service doors, my heart hammering like a trapped bird against my ribs. The exit was right there. Beyond it lay the armored car, the airport, and the chance to disappear back to a life where nobody knew the taste of metallic fear. I stood at the threshold, my breath coming in ragged gasps, looking at the silver exit sign. Then I looked back. Through the haze of smoke and the flash of gunfire, I saw him. Taejun was pinned behind a fallen obsidian table, his silver hair a beacon in the red light. He was fighting like a demon, but he was outnumbered.
2 men were flanking him from the balcony above, their red laser sights dancing across his back, right over the dragon tattoo that held the names of everyone he had already lost. The searching gaze I had used to find his secrets now found my purpose. I didn't see a 75-year-old man. I saw the only person who had ever truly seen me.
I didn't flee. I turned back into the fire. I grabbed a heavy silver tray from a passing waiter station and hurled it with everything I had at the nearest attacker, the clatter distracting him just long enough for me to reach the floor. I didn't have a gun, but I had the knowledge Tae-jun had forced me to learn, the layout of the room, the weaknesses of the men he fought, and the cold, calculated resolve of a woman who had nothing left to lose. I dove behind the table beside him, the wood splintering above my head as a bullet whined past. Tae-jun looked at me, his face a mask of shock and fury. "I told you to leave! And I told you I'm not a victim!" I screamed over the roar of the room. I reached down, grabbing a fallen firearm from a downed guard, my fingers steady despite the adrenaline. I didn't hesitate. I leveled the weapon at the balcony and fired, the kickback jarring my shoulder as the man above us crumpled. Tae-jun stared at me for a fraction of a second, the shock in his eyes melting into a dark, fierce pride that burned brighter than any gala light. He reached out, his bloody knuckles brushing my cheek, a silent acknowledgement that the contract was dead. This wasn't a merger anymore, it was a partnership. "Together, then," he growled, his voice a battle cry. "Together," I echoed, my white lace now stained with the grit of the city. We stood as one, the Silver Lion and his African Queen. And as the doors to the ballroom burst open with the arrival of Tae-jun's loyal reinforcements, I realized that I hadn't chosen the safe path. I had chosen the bloodier one. And as I looked at the man beside me, I knew I would do it again 1,000 times over. The aftermath of the gala felt like the world had been scrubbed raw. The golden ballroom was gone, replaced by the sterile, cold interior of a high-speed convoy cutting through the rain-drenched streets of Seoul. I sat in the back of the armored sedan, my gold and black gown torn at the hem, my hands still smelling of gunpowder. Beside me, Tae-jun was a statue of obsidian and ice. He didn't look at me. He stared out the window as he made call after call, his voice a low, rhythmic growl that sent chills down my spine. The Silver Lion was no longer prowling. He was on the hunt. "Tonight was a message, Lillian," he said, finally hanging up the encrypted phone. He turned to me, and the predatory intensity in his eyes was so sharp it felt like a physical touch. They thought they could strike at my heart and find it hollow. They forgot that I have spent 50 years building this empire out of the bones of men who underestimated me. We didn't go back to the mansion. We went to the docks, the very place where Captain Choi had tried to sell our secrets. The air was thick with the scent of salt, diesel, and impending violence. The rain hammered against the corrugated metal of the warehouses as we stepped out of the car. Tae-jun's men, a small army of shadows, stood in perfect formation, their heads bowed in a silence that felt heavier than the storm. In the center of the warehouse, under the flickering buzz of industrial lights, the young pretender Choi and the survivors of the gala ambush were bound and kneeling. They looked small. They looked pathetic. The Japanese syndicate leaders had fled, leaving their pawns to face the dragon's wrath alone. Tae-jun walked into the light, his black overcoat billowing behind him. He didn't need a weapon. His presence was enough to make the air turn cold. He stopped in front of Choi, who was trembling so violently that the wood of his chair rattled. "You told my wife that I was a monument," Tae-jun said, his voice a terrifyingly calm whisper that echoed off the high rafters. "You told her I was a history book. You were right about one thing, Choi. History is written in blood, and tonight
You are going to be the ink." Taejun reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, ornate silver lighter, the one I had seen him use 1,000 times. He flicked it open, the flame dancing in his silver-gray eyes. He didn't look at Choi's face. He looked at the warehouse around them, filled with the rerouted shipments that had been stolen from our family. "You tried to take my docs. You tried to take my life. But worst of all," Taejun leaned down, his face inches from Choi's. "You tried to touch what belongs to me. You looked at Lillian and saw a weakness. I looked at her and saw a reason to burn the world." With a single dismissive motion, Taejun tossed the lighter onto a trail of gasoline that had been poured around the traders. The fire roared to life in an instant, a wall of orange heat that turned the warehouse into a furnace. Taejun didn't flinch. He didn't even watch the flames. He turned his back on the carnage and walked toward me, the light of the fire casting his shadow long and jagged across the concrete floor. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of my neck, his thumb tracing the dragon tattoo on his own throat. The heat of the fire was at his back, but his touch was steady, protective, and overwhelmingly dominant. "It is done," Taejun murmured in English. "The rats have been cleared from the house. There is no one left in this city who doesn't know your name, Lillian, and there is no one left who will dare to whisper it without fear." I looked past him at the burning warehouse, the symbol of his absolute authority. I should have felt horror. I should have been repulsed by the casual cruelty of his justice. But as I looked into his eyes, I realized that this was the price of the life I had chosen. He had destroyed them not just for his throne, but for my safety. He had shown the world that the Silver Lion was still the boss, and that his African queen was untouchable. I reached up, my fingers stained with the grit of the night, and rested my hand over his heart. It was beating slow and strong, the heart of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. "I know who you are now, Taejun," I whispered, the heat of the fire warming my face. "And I know who I am."
He pulled me into his arms, his iron grip a sanctuary in the middle of the chaos. The war for Seoul was over, and the reign of the Lion and the Queen had truly begun. The victory at the docks had come with a jagged, hidden price. As the warehouse fire died down to embers, a stray bullet from a dying sniper had found its mark, piercing through the side of the Silver Lion before the threat was neutralized. The drive to the private medical wing of the Dongho estate was a blur of high-speed turns and the rhythmic, terrifying sound of Taejun's labored breathing. Inside the sterile, white-walled recovery suite, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that surpassed even the gala ambush. Taejun lay unconscious, his usually imposing frame swallowed by monitors and wires. Without his presence, the mansion felt like a kingdom without a sun. In the hallway, the captains and lieutenants paced like restless wolves, their voices rising in heated Korean as they argued about who would lead the retaliation. They assumed the African bride was in the room weeping. They were wrong. I stepped out of the hospital room, the door clicking shut behind me. I had traded my torn gown for a sharp charcoal gray suit that belonged in a boardroom, and my hair was pulled back into a tight, severe bun. The searching gaze I had once used to find mercy in Taejun's eyes was now as cold as a mountain lake. "Silence," I said. It wasn't a shout, but the word, spoken in the low, guttural Korean of the underworld, cut through their arguing like a blade. The men froze, staring at me in shock. Captain Han, a senior advisor with graying temples, stepped forward with a condescending scowl. "Miss Albert, this is a matter for the family council. You should return to the chairman's bedside." I didn't blink.
I walked toward him until I was inches from his face, mirroring the predatory stance Tae-jun had used on Director Kang. The family council is currently looking at the only person Tae-jun Dong-ho trusts with his life. I am the chairman's wife, and in his absence, I am his voice. You don't know the business, Han sneered. The Japanese are regrouping. The docks are in chaos. I know that the Japanese haven't regrouped, I countered, my voice dropping to a dangerous silk. I know that they are currently hiding in a safe house near the Guro district because their leader is waiting for a wire transfer from your private account, Captain Han. The air in the hallway turned to ice. Han's face drained of color, his eyes darting toward the other captains. That's an absurd lie. You're a foreigner. You don't know what you're saying. I pulled a small black notebook from my pocket, the one where I had recorded every whispered secret I had overheard since learning their language. I know that you met with the syndicate's envoy at the tea house on Thursday. I know you promised them access to our pharmaceutical routes in exchange for a seat on the council. And I know, I stepped closer, my voice vibrating with Tae-jun's own authority, that the chairman's wife is in any meeting that the strongest of the captains attends. I turned my gaze to the other captains, men who were now looking at Han with growing suspicion. Tae-jun didn't marry me to be a decoration. He married me to be his eyes. While you were busy looking at my skin and my age, I was busy looking at your betrayals. Before Han could reach for his weapon, two of Tae-jun's personal bodyguards, men who had witnessed my bravery at the gala, stepped forward and pinned him against the wall.
Take him to the basement, I commanded. He will wait there until the chairman is awake to decide his fate. The remaining men stood in a stunned, heavy silence. They looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. They didn't see a 22-year-old girl from Kampala. They saw a woman who had mastered their language, their games, and their ruthlessness. The Japanese safe house in Guro, I said, looking at the senior-most loyalist. Send the strike team now. No survivors. If anyone asks who gave the order, tell them it was the queen of the house of Dong-ho. The men bowed, low, deep, and sincere. Yes, Semonim, they chorused. I watched them scramble to follow my orders, the power flowing through my veins like a cold current. I walked back into Tae-jun's room and sat by his bed, taking his large, calloused hand in mine. His eyes flickered open, hazy with pain, but sharp enough to see me. They obeyed you? He whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his pale lips. They didn't have a choice, I replied, leaning down to kiss his forehead. I told you I was a sword, Tae-jun. I just finally decided to stop hiding the blade. He squeezed my hand, his silver-gray eyes filled with a pride that transcended any contract. The lion was wounded, but his empire had never been more secure. I settled in for the vigil, knowing that the world would never look at Lillian Albert and see a victim ever again. The winter in Seoul arrived with a quiet, majestic stillness, covering the iron gates of the Dong-ho estate in a dusting of crystalline white. Inside the master suite, the air was warm and smelled of cedarwood and the faint, sweet scent of Ugandan tea. Tae-jun sat by the massive window, the scars on his side having long since healed into silver memories. He was no longer the untouchable titan I had met in that silent chapel. He was a man whose strength had been tempered by the very softness he had tried to protect. I stood behind him, my hands resting on his shoulders. I wasn't wearing the lace of a bride or the charcoal suit of a regent. I wore a simple, elegant wrap of deep violet, a color that signaled both royalty and peace. As I looked at our reflection in the glass, I saw how much had changed. My searching gaze wasn't hunting for exits anymore. It was resting on home.
Taejun reached up, his large, calloused hand covering mine, pulling it down to rest over the dragon on his neck. The names in the scales were still there, but the ink seemed less like a shroud and more like a testament. He had spent 75 years building a fortress to keep the world out, never realizing he was actually building a throne for someone to sit beside him.
"The snow reminds me of the night you arrived," he murmured, his silver-gray eyes reflecting the soft winter light. "You looked at me like I was the monster in your father's stories. I thought I would be lucky if you didn't try to kill me in my sleep." I laughed softly, leaning my cheek against his silver hair. "I thought about it, once or twice, usually after you were particularly difficult about my training." He turned in his chair, pulling me onto his lap with an ease that still made my heart flutter. He looked at me with an intensity that had moved past possession and into a profound, soul-deep devotion. He was a man who had seen everything, done everything, and yet he looked at me as if I were the only miracle he had ever witnessed. "You saved the empire, Lillian," he said, his voice dropping to that gravelly register I had grown to crave. "You faced the wolves when I couldn't. You showed them that the house of Dong-ho doesn't just have a head, it has a heart. I gave you a contract, but you gave me a reason to stay in this world a little longer." I looked into those piercing gray eyes, seeing the reflection of the woman I had become. I thought back to the girl in Kampala who thought her life ended the moment her father bowed to a stranger. I thought of the fear, the blood at the docks, the linguistic battles, and the weight of the gold on my wrists. I realized then that I hadn't lost my life in that merger. I hadn't been diminished by this man's age or his darkness. Instead, I had been forged in his fire. He hadn't stolen my youth. He had given it a purpose. He hadn't trapped me in a cage. He had handed me the keys to a kingdom and the heart of the king who built it. I reached out, my thumb tracing the sharp line of his jaw, lingering on the silver stubble. The cultural divide between Uganda and Korea, the 50-year chasm of our ages, none of it mattered. We were two souls who had found a common language in the silence of the storm. "I used to think my father destroyed me," I whispered, my voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. "I used to think this wedding dress was a burial shroud, but standing here with you, looking at what we've built, I realized I didn't lose anything." I leaned in, my lips brushing his, sealing a vow that no contract could ever capture. I pulled back just enough to see the spark of love and respect in his gaze, the look of a man who was no longer alone. "I'm grateful for having you in my life, Taejun," the title of our story finally finding its breath. He didn't respond with words. He didn't have to. He simply pulled me closer, his arms an iron sanctuary against the winter cold. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Seoul, but inside the mansion, the African girl and the silver lion were finally at peace. I hadn't just survived the monster, I had learned to run the jungle with him. The hidden epic of Lillian and Taejun was no longer a story of a debt paid. It was the legend of a kingdom found. "The snow reminds me of the night you arrived," he murmured, his silver-gray eyes reflecting the soft winter light. "You looked at me like I was the monster in your father's stories. I thought I would be lucky if you didn't try to kill me in my sleep." I laughed softly, leaning my cheek against his silver hair. "I thought about it, once or twice, usually after you were particularly difficult about my training." He turned in his chair, pulling me onto his lap with an ease that still made my heart flutter. He looked at me with an intensity that had moved past possession and into a profound, soul-deep devotion. He was a man who had seen everything, done everything, and yet he looked at me as if I were the only miracle he had ever witnessed. "You saved the empire, Lillian,"
he said, his voice dropping to that gravelly register I had grown to crave. You faced the wolves when I couldn't. You showed them that the house of Dong Ho doesn't just have a head, it has a heart. I gave you a contract, but you gave me a reason to stay in this world a little longer. I looked into those piercing gray eyes, seeing the reflection of the woman I had become. I thought back to the girl in Kampala who thought her life ended the moment her father bowed to a stranger. I thought of the fear, the blood at the docks, the linguistic battles, and the weight of the gold on my wrists. I realized then that I hadn't lost my life in that merger. I hadn't been diminished by this man's age or his darkness. Instead, I had been forged in his fire. He hadn't stolen my youth, he had given it a purpose. He hadn't trapped me in a cage, he had handed me the keys to a kingdom and the heart of the king who built it. I reached out, my thumb tracing the sharp line of his jaw, lingering on the silver stubble. The cultural divide between Uganda and Korea, the 50-year chasm of our ages, none of it mattered. We were two souls who had found a common language in the silence of the storm. I used to think my father destroyed me, I whispered, my voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. I used to think this wedding dress was a burial shroud, but standing here with you, looking at what we've built, I realized I didn't lose anything. I leaned in, my lips brushing his, sealing a vow that no contract could ever capture. I pulled back just enough to see the spark of love and respect in his gaze, the look of a man who was no longer alone. I'm grateful for having you in my life, Taejun, the title of our story finally finding its breath. He didn't respond with words, he didn't have to. He simply pulled me closer, his arms an iron sanctuary against the winter cold. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Seoul, but inside the mansion, the African girl and the silver lion were finally at peace. I hadn't just survived the monster, I had learned to run the jungle with him. The hidden epic of Lillian and Taejun was no longer a story of a debt paid. It was the legend of a kingdom found.